Where he studied under Milton Friedman, among others. Taught at Harvard, served as senior staff economist, president of the Council of Economic Advisors. Before moving to Virginia Tech, he has been professor of economics there since then. All his research has focused primarily on urban economics, public finance, voting rules, social justice. In '75, he collaborated with Nobel laureate James Buchanan in writing on gold, money, and the law. He's been a long-time invaluable advisor to AMI. Please welcome Professor Nic Tideman.
I'm not really a monetary specialist, but I've always had an interest in money, really going back to the age of 15. Some of you have copies of Rights versus Privilege, written by Robert DeFremery. Robert DeFremery was a good friend of my father's. So from the age of 15, I was aware of the idea of 100% reserve banking and thought it was a very good idea. Went to college thinking I'd be a mathematician, but mathematics got hard and economics was easy, so I shifted over. Yes. And I've worked with a lot of well-known economists, and at the same time, well, you can't describe me as a mainstream economist. I've got rather radical ideas about all sorts of things. And I should also warn you that I believe in the division of labor in social change, and I'm not an activist. I'm a thinker. And I think wild thoughts, and sometimes they come to something and sometimes they don't. But it's just not my nature to go out and knock on doors. I have on a couple of occasions talked to congressmen, but my heart really wasn't in it. So you'll get from me ideas, but you'll have to organize elsewhere to get people to participate with you in actually implementing change. Another characteristic of my perspective is that I'm not much inclined to compromise. I'm a purist. Now, I recognize people who get things done have to compromise, and I'm not going to criticize you for compromising, but don't expect me to endorse compromise in my own thoughts. Okay, now, at the same time, as I say I'm not an activist, you might say, an activist theorist. I think about how activism might possibly be done. And so I think that people who want to accomplish social change are well advised to look and see how other social change was accomplished. And especially, as in the case of monetary reform, it's important to look at social change that was accomplished despite having strong opposition from huge financial interests. I think the best example is ending slavery. You might have thought that slavery could never end because the slave owners would oppose it. It's interesting that slavery existed in the northern colonies, in the northern states in 1776, but anti-slavery legislation was passed in all the northern states between 1776 and 1787. Something happened that made it possible to go against the interests of the northern slave owners, where slavery was not so economically important, but did extend to the South. Although it's also interesting that slavery, there were cases in the South in the years around then and before, when individual slave owners would free their slaves because they realized it was the right thing to do. One of these families was the family of Dolly Madison's parents, the Payne family of North Carolina, who had a plantation that was run by slaves. They decided that slavery was wrong, they freed their slaves and became rather poor. So sometimes it's possible to persuade people out of a sense of principle that you have to change. So it's interesting to examine how that happens. So I think that it's important to stress the moral dimension of monetary reform. What's really immoral about monetary reform is that bankers make promises they can't keep. They say you can have your money whenever you want it, and it isn't true. Any other business that makes promises that are visibly impossible to keep is declared in bankruptcy and liquidated. But banks have the privilege of not being subject to that rule, and that's wrong. Well, so much about the structure of reform. I want to now talk about the structure of monetary reform in particular. And I want to point out that there are three components of monetary reform. And as it happens, I agree with the American Monetary Institute on two of them, and I disagree on one. The one that I agree on is one that I think you find in monetary reform organizations all around the world, of which there are many. And that is that fractional reserve banking is wrong. We ought to have a system where deposits are not lent out. Sometimes I think of it in terms of a law, that a contract to pay a debt on demand is unenforceable. The idea that you could be obliged, whenever somebody asks for it, to pay money that you promised to pay them whenever they ask for it, just doesn't make any sense. The contract to pay money on demand should not be enforced. And so, similarly, if you, well, and unless it's a contract to store an asset. So banks should be allowed to take your money and pay it back to you on demand, as long as they keep the money in the vault, or the electronic equivalent. They have the money, they can give it back to you whenever they want. That's what it should mean to put your money in the bank. So this is something that all monetary reformers seem to agree on. And I think to the extent you want to make common cause with other monetary reform organizations, you will find this point of common agreement. One economist who has written about monetary reform that I found interesting is Lawrence Kotlikoff of Boston University. He has a book with the bizarre title of Jimmy Stewart is Dead, referring to the Jimmy Stewart character in It's a Wonderful Life. He proposes a complement to ending fractional reserve banking that I hadn't seen elsewhere, and I think is rather attractive. Maybe I hadn't seen it only because I don't read the literature now. But what he proposes is that banks become agents for mutual funds. So if you want to put your money in the bank and get a return on it, the banker says, what mutual fund would you like to buy? I can sell you a mutual fund that invests in car loans or home loans or credit card debt or any other kind of asset you might want to invest in. People invest in these assets, whatever they like, and if some asset turns out to be bad, they lose their money. And if it turns out well, then they make money. And the bank never goes bust because the bank has no risk, is not taking any risk at all. That, it seems to me, is a very interesting idea to put together with ending fractional reserve banking. So if you haven't thought about that before, I suggest you think about it. The second component in my list of components of monetary reform is the transition process. Until I came upon the American Monetary Institute, I was really quite fuzzy in my own head about how the transition process would go. And I think it's a great service that the American Monetary Institute has done to specify the transition process. And the key thing about the transition process is that it's linked to the repayment of the debt that is now our money. When I saw that and thought about how it worked, I said, yes, that's the right way to do it. You can't do it overnight. Debt is money. You extinguish money whenever a debt is paid, and you want the money supply to be stable, so you should put more money into circulation exactly as that debt is paid back. I think that's a wonderful idea. I think that if other monetary reformers have not encountered that, you might gain their respect by getting them to see the wisdom of that idea. Now, the third component of a system of monetary reform is a plan for how money is created. And this is where I disagree with the American Monetary Institute. American Monetary Institute has the money created by being spent into circulation by government. And I think that this is not a good idea. For three reasons. First is that in order to increase the money supply by spending the money into existence, you either have to decrease taxes or you have to increase spending. And governments can decrease taxes and they can increase spending. They do it all the time. But they never do it on schedule. It seems to me overly optimistic to suppose that you can tell the Congress you have to lower taxes by $2.6 billion in the next 3 months. You have to increase spending by $2.6 billion in the next 3 months. They just aren't set up to decrease taxes or increase spending according to a schedule. You want to get that money into circulation precisely on schedule, and I don't see how the Congress can possibly do it. The second reason why I oppose having the money spent into existence is that I would like Congress to evaluate spending possibilities in terms of a full value dollar. I don't want to give them cheap dollars to spend. I don't want to tell them, well, you got to spend this money on something, so they don't have something that's really worthwhile to spend it on. Spend it on something else that isn't worthwhile. We got to get this money into circulation. Now, maybe you could have tax cuts that were precise enough to do the job, but that seems to be implausible too. You'd have to, this is the issue of waste. With respect to the issue of waste, I think that if you tell Congress you got to spend this money or lower taxes, and they're not going to be serious about evaluating spending and valuing taxation in an appropriate way. That's the second reason. Now, my third reason for opposing the spending of money in circulation is that I think there's another way of doing it that is the right way and deserves to be done. And that is to give money, to lend money to taxpayers as tax deferral loans. So my idea is that everybody would have a line on the bank statement. You go online and it shows how much you have in your checking account, how much you have in your savings account, how much you owe on your home equity line of credit, whatever other transactions you have in your bank. That's what happens when I do it. I assume you do it too. Then there'd be another line, which is your Fed tax deferral loan. The Fed tax deferral loan would have an interest rate of 0. And every time we needed to expand the money supply, the Fed would just put this money into everybody's account automatically. Just see it overnight, instantly, exactly the right amount of money. But so this is simple, but there's also a sense in which it satisfies an economic principle of efficiency. The principle of economic efficiency that I'm talking about is the principle of internalizing externalities. I don't know if you've heard about it, but this is, the economists say that when there's some harm that happens between people who don't have a contract between them, you need a charge on the person who causes the harm equal to the amount of the harm. This is why economists like pollution taxes and congestion taxes, to bring the cost of a person's action to bear on him and make people pay for the cost of what they do. In the same way that economists like to internalize negative externalities, they like the idea of internalizing positive externalities where this is financially feasible. So if somebody plants flowers in their front yard and this raises the value of surrounding property, we like the idea of giving that person a reward for that corresponding to the increase in the value of property, and collect a tax from the people who get the benefit. We can't always collect the tax from people who benefit, and so we don't always have the revenue to internalize the positive externalities. But in principle, if we wanted to motivate people to do the good things that they have the capacity to do, we ought to pay them for the value that they generate. And that's the principle of internalizing a positive externality. Well, how does this relate to money? Suppose I begin to feel worried and think I need to keep another $1,000 in my pocket. So right now what I have to do is cut back on spending and save $1,000 to put in my pocket. And if we have a monetary authority that is aware of my doing this, they could issue another $1,000 in money without inflation, the $1,000 that goes into my pocket. So you could say that to the extent that people want to add to their cash balances, that creates a positive externality for whoever is issuing the money. And we want to internalize that positive externality. Then we say to people, whenever you want to put more money in your pocket, well, we'll take notice of that fact and print the money and put it in your pocket. It doesn't cost anything to print the money. We internalize the externalities. We avoid deflation by printing money and putting it in everybody's pockets. So go back to 2008. Suddenly everybody felt scared. And the Fed reduced the interest rate to zero, and the banks, and then created a bunch of money out of thin air, and the banks couldn't find anybody they wanted to lend it to, and he had a deflation. If we could have followed the idea that I have in mind, what would have happened is, as people decided that they felt scared and they didn't have money, more money in their pockets, the Fed would have generated that money out of nothing like they do, and put it in people's bank accounts so that they could would have put whatever amount of money it took to be put in people's pockets. They would have been willing to continue to spend whatever they needed to spend to keep the economy at full employment. And once they recovered their sense of security and thought they didn't need the money anymore, the Fed would have said, okay, now it's time to pay the money back. That's my plan for stabilizing the economy, for creating money in monetary reform, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Lincoln.
I took such a short amount of time that there's plenty of time for questions unless you want to catch up to the schedule.
Well, that's what I'm trying.
You're trying to catch up with the schedule. Well, let me just take one question, then go on.
You called it a loan, and is there a death tax then, or a death payback when the person dies?
I left out part of the scheme. I want the loan to be proportional to how much taxes you paid in the last 5 years. So as people get old, they tend to get out of the economy, they don't pay as much taxes, and the loan would go down. I've also thought that perhaps I need to add to my system an obligation to buy an insurance policy that would pay off the loan if you died without being able to pay it off. But yes, the loan has to be paid when you leave the economy. Since we're behind schedule, I'll take questions at other times. Not now.
Thank you. Thank you. Today is an especially long day. we have to be out of here at 5 o'clock. The caterers have to set up for dinner, and then we have the celebration later. So I apologize. We do this every year. We get messed up with Skype. And it's our fault, it's not your fault. So we'll take a coffee break now.